Ron Weasley's older brothers, Fred and George Weasley, are typically known by fans as the mischievous twin brothers, defined by pranks, jokes, and light-hearted chaos. They are the comic relief of the Weasley family. The boys who turn Hogwarts corridors into testing grounds, mock authority at every opportunity, and somehow make even rebellion feel fun. And while most of the time their behaviour consists of harmless troublemaking, there are actually a few moments throughout the series where Fred and George's actions become far more questionable. And while I'm unsure of what their intent may have been in these situations, I'd argue that their behaviour was borderline evil. No longer harmless pranks, but instead genuinely cruel or sadistic behaviour. There are 3 moments in particular that come to mind, only one of which made it into the films. So if you're a movie-only fan, then some of this is going to be eye-opening for you. Let's peel back the curtain on the Weasley twins and take a look at their darkest moments in the series. Let's dive into it. Unbreakable Vow. In Half-Blood Prince, the series introduces us to one of the most serious magical agreements in the wizarding world, the Unbreakable Vow. Unlike a normal promise, this is not just a verbal commitment or a symbolic gesture. It's a magically enforced contract, binding one witch or wizard to the terms they have agreed to. The 2 people involved face each other and join right hands, while the third person acts as the bonder. This third person touches their wand to the clasped hands and speaks the terms of the agreement aloud, one condition at a time. The best example of this in this series is when Narcissa Malfoy begs Snape to protect Draco. Snape agrees to watch over him, to help him complete Voldemort's task, and if Draco can't do it himself, to carry out the mission in his place. Bellatrix serves as the bonder, and from that moment onward, the vow is treated as absolute. And perhaps the most important detail is that the consequence for breaking an unbreakable vow is death. Seems pretty serious. The Snape and Narcissa scenario is the unbreakable vow most people think of, but what if I told you that this magic was actually used much earlier on in the series, before Harry ever even stepped foot in Hogwarts, and it involved, you guessed it, Fred and George. At some point before the events of the first book, around 1985 or 1986, when Ron was only about 5 years old, Fred and George tried to coerce their younger brother into an unbreakable vow. And at first it almost sounds like a joke, because of course it does, it's Fred and George. But the second you remember what an unbreakable vow actually does, this moment becomes a lot darker. Because Fred and George weren't just trying to trick Ron into eating a tongue toffee, or scare him with a fake spider. They were trying to magically bind their 5-year-old brother to a promise that could have killed him if he ever broke it. And what makes this even worse is that, according to Ron, they weren't just talking about it, they were ready to do it. They had their wands out, they were holding hands, and the ritual was apparently about to happen when Arthur Weasley walked in and stopped them. Fred and George tried to get me to make one when I was about 5. I nearly did too. I was holding hands with Fred and everything when Dad found us. And apparently Arthur's reaction was quite telling. Arthur is usually known as one of the calmer members of the family, typically stepping aside and leaving the explosive rage to his wife. But when recalling the incident, Ron specifically says that this was the only time Arthur ever got as angry as Molly. In other words, this was not treated like normal Fred and George mischief. This wasn't boys will be boys. This was serious enough that Arthur completely lost it. To be totally fair here, Fred and George were very young themselves, probably only around 7 years old, so maybe they didn't fully understand the implications of what they were doing. It's also possible that they didn't even know how to perform it. But even if we give them the benefit of the doubt, the situation is still disturbing. Because either Fred and George were genuinely capable of performing an unbreakable vow at 7 years old, which would mean they came dangerously close to placing a lethal magical contract on their baby brother, or they were messing around with a piece of magic they didn't understand, which is arguably almost as reckless. Either way, this wasn't harmless or mischievous, it was genuinely dangerous, and honestly quite dark. And I think that this is the key point. With Fred and George, we are so used to laughing at the outcome of their pranks that we sometimes forget to ask what could have happened if things went wrong. And in this case, if Arthur hadn't walked in when he did, Ron may have been magically bound to a promise before he was even old enough to properly understand what he was agreeing to, with the risk of death if he didn't comply with the vow. Weasley twin torture. This one is dark and it involves the Vanishing Cabinet. The Vanishing Cabinet is one of those magical objects that seems almost harmless when it's first introduced, but later becomes extremely important to the plot. On the surface, it's exactly what it sounds like, a cabinet that can make things vanish. But as we later learn, it's not just a disappearing box. A vanishing cabinet is actually a magical transportation device. When properly connected to another cabinet, it can move a person or object from one location to the other, almost like a hidden passageway. This becomes a major plot point in Half-Blood Prince, when Draco Malfoy uses the vanishing cabinet at Hogwarts, along with its twin at Borgin and Burke's, to create a secret route into the school. But years before Draco ever repairs it, the vanishing cabinet at Hogwarts already exists, and during Order of the Phoenix, Fred and George decide to use it in an extremely questionable way, taking things way too far when they lock a Slytherin student named Montague in the vanishing cabinet for several weeks. The incident occurs when Montague, working for the Inquisitorial Squad, tries to take points away from Gryffindor for their rule-breaking behaviour. In response, Fred and George force him into the broken vanishing cabinet, intending to teach him a lesson. However, the prank takes a dark turn when Montague becomes trapped inside the cabinet for weeks, unable to escape or communicate with the outside world. Montague told me that when he was stuck in the Hogwarts one. He was trapped in limbo, but sometimes he could hear what was going on at school, and sometimes what was going on in the shop, as if the cabinet was travelling between them. But he couldn't make anyone hear him. In the end, he managed to apparate out, even though he'd never passed his test. He nearly died doing it. During his confinement, Montague suffers from extreme physical and emotional distress, nearly dying in the process. He eventually manages to escape by using a combination of apparition and sheer desperation, despite not knowing where he was or how to apparate properly. This results in him being severely injured, reappearing within the Hogwarts plumbing system, and requiring extensive medical attention. This is another moment where the Fred and George are just pranksters defense starts to fall apart. Yes, Montague is part of the Inquisitorial Squad, yes, he was working with Umbridge, and yes, he was actively trying to punish Fred and George for breaking school rules. But their response was shoving him into a broken magical object they didn't fully understand and leaving him there. At this point in the story, nobody really seems to understand the cabinet properly, so it's not as though Fred and George had tested it, confirmed it was safe, and knew exactly where Montague would end up. They forced him into it without knowing what would happen. And the result was that Montague was effectively trapped between two places, completely isolated, unable to call for help, unable to escape, and slowly reaching the point where his only option was to attempt risky magic he wasn't qualified to perform. The whole ordeal is pretty horrifying. And when you strip away the framing of Fred and George pulled another prank, what actually happened here is that two students trapped another student in a magical limbo for weeks, causing him to almost die. Now, I'm not saying Fred and George necessarily intended for that to happen. I don't think they sat there and thought, let's nearly kill this guy, but intent isn't the only thing that matters. At a certain point, recklessness becomes so extreme that it stops being funny, and this is one of those points. There's also something to be said for the fact that they weren't really even remorseful, seemingly completely okay with the idea that he might be missing for weeks. He never managed to get all the words out due to the fact that we forced him headfirst into that vanishing cabinet on the first floor. But you'll get into terrible trouble. Not until Montague reappears, and that could take weeks. I don't know where we sent him. After all was said and done, Montague was traumatized, physically injured, and ended up in the hospital. And perhaps the most ironic part of all of this is that this prank actually ends up having massive consequences for the entire school. Because after Montague escapes, he tells Draco Malfoy what happened. He explains that while he was trapped, he could sometimes hear things happening at Hogwarts, and other times hear things happening in Borgin and Burke's. And this gives Draco the information he needs to realize that the Hogwarts vanishing cabinet has a twin. In other words, Fred and George's attempt to punish Montague accidentally helps Draco figure out how to smuggle Death Eaters into Hogwarts. So not only did this prank nearly kill a student, it also indirectly contributes to one of the biggest security breaches in the history of the school. I genuinely believe that this is one of the darkest things Fred and George ever did, and the strongest argument for that is simple. They seemed completely okay with trapping someone inside unknown magic for weeks without knowing where he was, what was happening to him, or whether he would ever be able to get out. Not a prank, just totally messed up and basically psychopathic. Love potions. When navigating the wizarding world through the perspective of a muggle, there are a lot of things that might raise a few eyebrows. Some in a morally dubious sense, and others simply because of how unbelievably astonishing they are. But in my view, there's perhaps nothing more sinister or baffling than the notion of a love potion, and that's quite a statement given what's out there. Think about it. It's a potion that you give to someone and it makes them fall involuntarily in love with you. For just a second, consider the power you could have over someone with this. One sip from a potion and they're infatuated with you. And all of this only feels even more bizarre when you consider the fact that we're constantly reminded of how powerful the force of love truly is in the wizarding world. And Fred and George, they've monetized that. Now, the first thing that I want to address is that there is no one love potion. There are actually lots of them in varying strengths and to some degree effects. However, perhaps the most commonly known love potion is known as amortentia. It's the most powerful love potion in the world, said Hermione. Quite right, you recognized it, I suppose, by its distinctive mother-of-pearl sheen. And to the steam rising in characteristic spirals, said Hermione enthusiastically. And it's supposed to smell differently to each of us, according to what attracts us. And I can smell freshly mown grass and new parchment, and amortentia works by producing a powerful infatuation or obsession in the drinker, and emits a scent unique to each individual, reflecting what they are most attracted to. However, one of the most important things to note here is that amortentia doesn't produce genuine love. It only mimics it, a semblance of love that is derived from strong obsession. It doesn't create genuine emotion or connection, and instead it overrides free will, making it, that's right, eerily similar to one of the 3 unforgivable curses. Even the magical world has its exceptions, and under Gamp's law, there are 5 things that magic cannot produce. In the series, love is shown to be a force that transcends magic, a driving force that can conquer evil, protect loved ones, and inspire acts of bravery and sacrifice. Simply put, it's OP. So given the power of love, it seems like it's a fitting exception to Gamp's law. Powerful infatuations can be induced by the skillful potioneer, but never yet has anyone managed to create the truly unbreakable, eternal, unconditional attachment that alone can be called love. But even though these love potions aren't creating genuine love, they're certainly still able to do a lot of damage. Love is powerful, but so is obsession. When someone falls under the influence of a love potion, their behaviour becomes erratic, intense, and often dangerous. They can become fixated on a single person to the point of losing all sense of self, ignoring reason, personal boundaries, and even morality. It's not affection, it's a magically induced obsession that strips away free will and creates a warped version of desire. One of the best examples is Romilda Vane's love potion, which accidentally ends up affecting Ron Weasley. Even in that relatively tame example, Ron becomes so out of control that he needs to be physically restrained, and that was just a schoolgirl crush. In more extreme cases, love potions have been linked to manipulation, long-term control, and even death. It was also a love potion that inadvertently led to the birth of Voldemort. His mother, Merope Gaunt, used one to enchant Tom Riddle Sr., luring him into a relationship he would have never chosen on his own. And many believe that Voldemort's inability to understand or feel love, a defining aspect of his psychopathy, can be traced back to his completely unnatural conception. Being born from a love potion, an artificial and manipulative force, left him incapable of forming genuine emotional connections, setting him on the path to darkness from the very beginning. I think it's safe to say that they're not light-hearted pranks or silly spells. They're dangerous dark magic disguised with a pretty label. Which brings me to my next point. If they aren't pranks, why are they sold in a prank shop? Weasley's Wizard Wheezers is the Wizarding World's premier establishment for all things mischief, mayhem, and magical madness. Founded by Fred and George Weasley, the iconic joke shop in Diagon Alley quickly became a haven for pranksters, offering everything from skiving snack boxes to Peruvian instant darkness powder. But among the shelves of trick wands and puking pastels lies something a little more unsettling. Love potions. Yes, right next to the fainting fancies and extendable ears, you'll find vials of shimmering liquid marketed as playful tools of flirtation. Harmless fun, right? But when you peel back the colourful packaging and consider what a love potion actually is, it stops feeling like a gag gift and starts feeling a little creepy. Because let's be clear, this isn't love, it's control. It's one person bending another's will, taking away their ability to choose who they love or even if they love at all. In the Muggle world, this would be considered an outrageous violation of consent, and yet in the Wizarding world, it's a casual item sold to teenagers in a joke shop. And if that doesn't make you a little uncomfortable, it probably should. And the strangest part is that the books don't really take them seriously either. Love potions aren't framed like dark magic, or discussed as even remotely in the same arena as the Imperious Curse, memory modification, or magical coercion. Instead, they are treated almost like a teenage nuisance, something silly, something that girls might try to sneak into school because they have a crush. But that framing is doing a lot of work, because the actual effect of the potion is horrifying. You are chemically, or rather magically, overriding their natural emotions and replacing them with obsession. And that's where Fred and George's involvement becomes so uncomfortable. Because they're not just aware that love potions exist, they are selling them, marketing them, and turning them into a commercial product. And yes, to be fair, Fred and George didn't invent love potions. The wizarding world clearly had them long before Weasley's Wizard Wheezers ever opened its doors. But Fred and George still choose to participate in that culture. And more than that, they profit from it. Weasley's Wizard Wheezers is supposed to be fun, and their entire brand is built around the idea that magic can be used to make people laugh. But by selling love potions under that same umbrella, they are effectively putting magical coercion in the same category as puking pastels. And if a prank takes away someone's ability to make their own decisions, is it still a prank? This also becomes even harder to defend when you remember who these products are being sold to. We're not just talking about fully grown adults in some heavily regulated potion shop. We're talking about a joke shop that is incredibly popular with Hogwarts students, teenagers, children really, people who are already impulsive, emotional, and immature, now being given access to potions that can manipulate another person's romantic feelings. And while Fred and George are usually presented as lovable rebels who push the boundaries of school rules, this is another area where I think they push past the boundaries of basic morality. Because when you sell someone a love potion, you're not just selling them a joke. You're selling them the ability to take someone else's choice away. And that's pretty damn dark. And that's it for today's video. If you enjoy the content, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, if I missed any other dark Fred and George moments, comment them down below. Until next time, remember, it does not do to dwell on dreams and forget to live